Today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. The American Revolution started because the British wanted to take over the American colonies.
To start off, one of the key movements was no taxation without representation. Because of this, the colonists were being heavily taxed without a say in government.
These taxes include the Sugar Act, the Tea Act,
and the Currency Act.
After these taxes were placed, tensions increased, and in Boston, a group of soldiers opened fire on a mob of colonists. 5 unarmed colonists were murdered, and everything changed. The colonists created rebel groups to fight against the unfair taxes, the most influential of which were the Sons of Liberty.
The Sons of Liberty are most famous for the Boston Tea Party. They dumped over 300 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor to fight against the Tea Act of 1773. This was important because it is the first significant act of defiance by the colonists. After this, the British placed the Intolerable Act, which closed the Boston port and made colonists pay for the damages.
After the Intolerable Act, the colonists were extremely angry and they formed the First Continental Congress.
The Congress was a body where men from all colonies were formally represented.
The Congress had some militia, and in April of 1775, the British Army was sent out to capture rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They met at Lexington and Concord, and the first shots were exchanged. The revolution officially started.
The first shot was known as the shot heard around the world. This was the start of the revolution and the fight for America's independence. After the first shot heard around the world, King George III spoke to the Parliament saying that the American colonies are in a state of rebellion. The war for independence officially started.
Some advantages that the colonists had was better leadership, they knew the land, they had a motivation, and they also had foreign aid from Spain and France. The British had the most powerful military in the world at the time. Their soldiers were well equipped, well disciplined, well paid, and well fed.
Some important figures for the colonists were George Washington, John Adams, Paul Revere, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. The most influential man was George Washington. He led the colonist army to victory, and he would later become the first president of the United States.
Paul Revere is most known as the man who alerted the colonists that the British were coming. He was also responsible for organizing an alarm system that made it easier to keep tabs on British forces.
Benjamin Franklin had an important role in strengthening the colonies, with professions in publishing, diplomacy, and science.
The important figures for the British were King George III and General Charles Edwin Cornwallis. King George was a king of England for 59 years and was in charge of placing the harsh taxes on the colonists.
Charles Cornwallis was a British general who led British forces in New York and in Philadelphia.
Lexington and Concord was the start of the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere had seen that the British were coming and he sounded the alarms.
The militia and the British Army fought, and at the end of the battle, 90 colonists and 250 British died. This gave the colonists a lot of confidence to fight against one of the most powerful armies in the world.
The Battle of Bunker Hill happened in Boston. The colonists were outnumbered but had a tactical advantage of high ground. The British had 1,000 casualties and the colonists had 400 casualties. At the end of the battle, the British won. This battle was important because now the British realized that the war will be harder than they thought.
The Declaration of Independence was written on July 4th, 1776. The whole point of the Declaration was to declare separation from Britain. It explains their right to fight for freedom. It also gave the colonists something to fight for.
At the Battle of Saratoga, both sides came face to face. The colonists were outnumbered and they were forced to fall back. This battle is important because it convinced the French to provide military assistance.
The last and final battle was the Siege of Yorktown led by George Washington, with the goal of capturing General Cornwallis. The colonists had them surrounded on land and the French had them surrounded with their battleships, preventing their escape by sea. The colonists' victory at Yorktown forced Britain to negotiate.
By November 1782, the British and American commissioners had reached an agreement and they signed preliminary peace. But under the Franco-American alliance, this peace treaty could not go through until France and Britain reached an agreement.
On January 20th, 1783, all parties reached agreement and an armistice was declared.
September 3rd, the Treaty of Paris was signed. On that day, the War for American Independence officially concluded. After the conclusion, George Washington became the first president.
And the 13 colonies would later form the United States of America.